The ending of She-Ra's Season 4 introduces the final villain of the series, Horde Prime. In contrast to Catra and Hordak, Horde Prime is calm, collected, and eloquent. But while he presents himself as polite and cordial, this attitude is only a facade, an illusion that masks his true intentions. Prime desires nothing but the complete physical and mental domination of everything he sees. He is menacing in a completely different manner to any of the previous antagonists. When he forces his mind into the body of his clones or his chipped followers, there's a retching sense of body horror as we see the victim twist and crack to accept the override. Even deeper than that, Prime's fanatical clones and foreboding architecture evoke the anxiety of manipulative cults. But above all else, there's something even more terrifying in the way Prime presents himself, intimidates his enemies, and controls his followers. It's the horror of fascism. Let's quickly disclose that fascism is infamously difficult to describe. As with all political beliefs, it's complicated, but fascism is less of a well-defined ideology and more of an amalgamation of ideas and beliefs that connect to fit its narrative. Italian philosopher Umberto Eco writes in his essay Fascism, on the contrary, fascism had no quintessence. Fascism was a fuzzy totalitarianism, a collage of different philosophical and political ideas, a beehive of contradictions. This enigmatic aspect of fascism is part of the reason why it is so dangerous, as it can take many different forms. The most famous example is obviously Nazi Germany, but make no mistake, fascism is not an exclusively Western phenomenon. Fascism can arise anywhere in which there is inequality, as it manipulates the genuine desire for change into a hunger for death and destruction. Fascism sees the people within itself not as free-thinking citizens, but as malleable tools in a machine. Luckily for us, Horde Prime stands as a case study of fascist manipulation and indoctrination techniques. Prime, and by extension fascism, uses these techniques to ensnare new followers, keep them dogmatically loyal, and turn them into eager soldiers for the cause. Horde Prime presents himself as no less than an omnipotent god, a being of insurmountable power and unstoppable will. His closest followers, primarily the clones, revere him as the uncontested emperor of the universe. The show emphasizes Prime's menacing appearance through his visual design. His stark, bleached white and sickly green color palette creates a sense of unease as it displays his completely otherworldly biology. His obsession with purity and light shows how he views his actions not as those of a conqueror, but of a divine savior. Prime feels no remorse or guilt for his eternal war, and he frames his enemies as
those who cling to the darkness.
This inspires a terrifying religious fanaticism in his followers. The visual design of his flagship makes any visitors feel small and insignificant. Its architecture is hollow and skeletal, appearing less like a lived-in space station and more like an empty husk. His barren throne room physically isolates his visitors and forces himself as the central visual point of focus. Even in the shot composition, Prime is framed as a towering and indomitable force, often viewed from low angles to emphasize his domineering figure. When Prime sends his transmissions to Etheria, he delivers his holograms as a colossal projection, gazing down at his soon-to-be subjects. His ability to transfer his consciousness into the bodies of his followers further emphasizes that he is invincible and immortal. Prime wants his enemies to know that fighting him is a futile endeavor. This overwhelming visual presence draws heavy parallels to fascist propaganda. The most infamous example of propaganda filmmakers is undoubtedly Leni Riefenstahl, whose film, Triumph of the Will, is infamous for its glorified, and tediously long, portrayal of the German Nazi Party as an overwhelming force. Works such as these use the inherent language of cinema to subconsciously influence the viewer's perspective. For example, Riefenstahl filmed the party leaders from below to intimidate the viewer. Conversely, when Horde Prime is shot from below, he is framed as the stronger force, looking down at the character, and by extension the viewer, from his high pedestal. The overwhelming use of these visual clues and framing devices is to project an illusion of unnatural strength, both to intimidate opponents and invigorate believers. A crucial part of how Horde Prime displays his unquestioned authority is through the relics of his conquest. Prime intimidates Glimmer by presenting an idealized past, an alternate view of history, presented as a series of weaker cultures and peoples who were unable to stand against the might of Prime's empire. He proudly presents hundreds of trophies from his previous victories, a delicately curated monument to his strength and ruthlessness. In his book, How Fascism Works, The Politics of Us and Them, Yale philosophy professor Jason Stanley writes how, "The strategic aim of these hierarchical constructions of history is to displace truth, and the invention of a glorious past includes the erasure of inconvenient realities. While fascist politics fetishizes the past, it is never the actual past that is fetishized." Prime never includes any mention of any weakness or flaw with his empire. In the worldview he presents, he is an eternal, immortal, and invincible force of nature. It is a mistake to fight, as his empire can reduce entire cultures to single trinkets. For the clones, and those who Prime chips, his world is one of security and protection. This idealized past is one of the core tenets of fascist doctrine, as it uses historical revisionism to appeal to its core demographic, presenting a lie of an Edenic past existence. The appeal of this lie is to stoke the flames of hatred and mistrust against whatever target the proponents choose. This allows fascism to mobilize forces under the lie of restoring a lost greatness. Both Prime and fascism manipulate the desire for security and historical greatness to enchant new followers under the guise of a glorious, united nation. This lie of a perfect empire is fueled by Prime's desire to have a seamless machine where
every part of the machine is of value, even you.
In Prime's view, everyone is welcome in his empire, provided that they can further the cause. From this point of view, it makes sense why Prime cast out Hordak.
No, brother, I did it. All of it. For you.
Choke me like you hate me.
Despite his tireless military work for Prime, Hordak had a physical defection in his cloning. Prime has no sympathy for those who contradict his view of himself, because if he views himself as perfect, any clone that fails to fulfill his vision must be cast out. This aspect of fascist ideology explains the National Socialist attitude towards the disabled. Described as Lebensunwertes Leben, life unworthy of life, disabled citizens were regarded as lacking in value, because one's value in National Socialist ideology arose from the value one's contributions to society through work. This is also why Prime seeks to eliminate the evidence of Hordak's conquest. Because he views Hordak as an incompetent defect and an embarrassment to his name, Horde Prime plans to erase Hordak's version of the Horde from history, thus wiping away any evidence that a part of his empire was weak or inadequate.
I cannot let word spread of my brother's botched conquest. For order to thrive, this whole mess must be wiped away.
This vision of a flawless, invincible empire creates a hive mind, both in the metaphorical and literal meaning. Horde Prime ensnares new believers in his empire with the promise of community and familial belonging. His constant use of little brother and little sister serve as far more than a simple nod to the Big Brother of George Orwell's 1984, but instead it acts as a deeply scarring psychological tactic. By invoking the language of familial connections, Prime preys on his victim's desire for belonging and acceptance. Prime draws on the relationship status as a big brother to foster obedience from his followers, particularly the clones. Wrong Hordak's terrified reaction from being disconnected from the hive mind shows how deeply ingrained this cult of loyalty is to the members.
Horde Prime, how will he see my thoughts? How will he know that I am faithful?
Horde Prime draws on the role of the patriarchal caretaker and demands obedience from his children, or in this case, the little siblings. In The Mass Psychology of Fascism, German psychologist Wilhelm Reich outlined the methods in which fascists use the social structure of family to instill a sense of traditional obedience in their supporters. He relates how, in the figure of the father, the authoritarian state has its representative in every family, so that the family becomes its most important instrument of power. The authoritarian position of the father reflects his political goal and discloses the relation of the family to the authoritarian state. This establishes an innate hierarchy, one in which superiors are always demanding unquestioning loyalty from their inferiors. But since the doctrine relies heavily on levying the superiority of the followers over the peers, so too must this follow in the party's internal structure. As Echo puts it, The leader, knowing that his power was not delegated to him democratically, but was conquered by force, also knows that his force is based upon the weaknesses of the masses. They are so weak as to need and deserve a ruler. Since the group is hierarchically organized according to a military model, every subordinate leader despises his own underlings, and each of them despises his inferiors. This reinforces the sense of mass elitism. We can see this system of elitism through hierarchy clearly within the Horde's internal structure. Horde Prime despised Hordak and exiled him. Hordak, in turn, viewed himself as superior over Shadow Weaver, who then enforced her own elitist mindset over Catra, who repeated this mindset again with Scorpia and the B-Team. Fascist politics encourages asserting dominance over any who is believed to be beneath you, even within your own faction. Acknowledging your own mistakes or flaws violates the idea that the party, and by extension you, are perfect and invincible. This cutthroat structure fuels jealousy, and encourages party members to become increasingly ruthless and dogmatically loyal, wagering their fanatical devotion as a sign of their own superiority. Catra is a perfect example of this effect in action. In an environment where showing weakness was frowned upon, Catra saw climbing the ranks within the hierarchy of the Horde as the only way to make herself feel better about her own feelings of insecurity. However, this sense of entitlement through hierarchical status is ultimately an illusion, sustained by Prime to keep his followers loyal to him, to forsake all other connections and dedicate themselves to his cause. As Stanley describes, hierarchy is a kind of mass delusion, one readily embraced by fascist politics. Horde Prime uses a barrage of contradictions and gaslighting to psychologically degrade his enemies and bully his followers into submission. In asserting control over the presentation of information with a mix of careful word choices and overwhelming lies, Prime manipulates the masses on an unimaginable scale. Stanley describes how regular and repeated obvious lying is part of the process by which fascist politics destroys the information space. A fascist leader can replace truth with power, ultimately lying without consequence. By replacing the world with a person, fascist politics makes us unable to assess arguments by a common standard. The fascist politician possesses these specific techniques to destroy information spaces and break down reality. In the book 1984, this reality-bending process is referred to as doublethink, and is best summarized by the 3 lines of the party mantra, the infamous, "War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength." Right off the bat, there are several connections to how Horde Prime sends his message. The first parallel is that Horde Prime announces that he brings peace with his conquest. He redirects the blame from any who defy him as their fault, that if only they submitted, they would have peace.
I apologize for my little brother. His actions are an embarrassment. I desire only peace and order.
According to Prime, the war is a necessary evil that must bring peace to the worlds that he visits. Repeated use of this tactic, combined with the attrition and chaos of war, has the chance of convincing enemies that they were entirely in the wrong to stand against him, and that the best course of action is to simply bend to the will of Horde Prime. The second contradiction within the cult of Horde Prime is that his empire is the light, and all others are clinging to the darkness. He frames his legion of mind-controlled servants this way to directly contradict his victims' view of the world. Light is a near universal symbol of ideas, thought, creativity, and truth. Darkness, on the other hand, is often a symbol of the lack of said truth, of deception, ignorance, and censorship. By posing himself, and by extension the Horde, as the light, he frames the war of those fighting against him as a form of enlightenment. The framing of himself as a godlike figure further emphasizes this factor. As he consistently declares his arrival as a salvation, and after suffering through the endless onslaught of his troops, he convinces his victims that they will be free under his will.
Look at you, poor sister. Your adorer causes you nothing but suffering. Don't you want to be free of it?
He promotes this idea of freedom and servitude as a way to further quell resistance, to convince them that they need his guidance and rule. As Reich describes, the salvation of the nation by an all-powerful Führer who had been sent by God was in complete accord with the intense desire for the masses for salvation. Once they are under Prime's control, new members of this empire must constantly avoid questioning Prime's orders or decisions. This draws eerie similarities to the ways in which that fascist governments put high pressure on those within to stay loyal above all costs, as questioning orders would mean that the orders are flawed, which in turn would mean that the party is not as perfect as it claims to be. Thus, it is better to remain ignorant and part of the collective masses. Naturally, this leads to a state of cognitive dissonance as those under the control of fascists struggle to maintain their sense of right and wrong. As Orwell details, to know and to not know, to be conscious of complete truthfulness while telling carefully constructed lies, to hold simultaneously two opinions which canceled out, knowing them to be contradictory and believing in both of them, consciously to induce unconsciousness, and then, once again, to become unconscious of the active hypnosis you had just performed. The ultimate goal of this psychological warfare is to attack the victim's very sense of reality, to convince them that they live in a world completely dedicated by Prime's whim. To attack such a primal human instinct as reality itself is what leads us into part of Horde Prime's true horror is linked to his existence as an alien consciousness. The ability for his soul to travel between bodies, even when his physical vessel dies, creates a terrifying foe. In a sense, the struggle against Prime represents less of combating an individual and more like trying to take down an idea. This is very similar to how fascism is often very personality-driven. The fanatical dogma creates an environment where if a leader disavows the beliefs or is arrested, others will take his place. Another way in which Prime's tactics overlap with fascist doctrine is through the creation of an other. This other, which is always a group of people of a different race, religion, or political affiliation, is used in fascist doctrine as a scapegoat, the reason why those under the control of the party are suffering. Prime reflects this aspect of fascist psychology through his hunt for She-Ra. He poses She-Ra as the reason why he is laying siege to the planet. According to his propaganda, it is She-Ra's fault that Prime must continue to decimate Etheria. Therein lies the contradiction, which also occurred in how Hordak framed the princesses in the beginning of the show. If She-Ra is so powerful that she can single-handedly stop Prime's assault, how can she be so weak that she is insignificant to Prime's plan? But the underlying fallacy doesn't matter, so long as people who are suffering have a scapegoat they can deliver, in the hopes that condemning said other will bring them peace and freedom. You don't need me to tell you what historical example this brings to mind. Fascists may believe that they are justified, and thus safe from the wrath of their beliefs, but they are most certainly not free from fascism's manipulative grasp. Fascism degrades and dehumanizes its own members through a strict intolerance of disobedience. Horde Prime displays how he treats insubordination through his punishment of Hordak. Even though Hordak created his empire to serve as an extension of Prime's will, Prime still views this as an act of disobedience. By giving himself a name and attempting to create his own version of the Horde, he defied Prime's vision. Prime cannot stand this action, as it presents a threat of critical thought. Within fascism, thinking is a form of emasculation. Fascism cannot abide analytical examination from within, and thus severely punishes insubordination as disloyalty. Another method in which fascism corrodes the very essence of those who live within it is the panopticon effect. With Prime sees all hammered into the minds of the people of Etheria, the people of the planet can feel the gaze of the Empire upon them even when neither the clones nor bots are near them. Prime does not need to necessarily chip everyone, as can be seen in Airlandia. In this town, most of the residents aren't chipped, but they still act in accordance with Prime, purely out of fear, not just of his robots and clones, but of chipped princesses. With but a few people with power under his command, Prime can enforce his will effortlessly. Prime, and by extension fascism, needs only to gain a link with those in power within a system to ensure the fear of observation. There are many historical examples of this, when fascism digs its hooks into people with positions of authority. However, for some reason, I just can't think of a modern example. Regardless, when the princesses in the rebellion stand up to Horde Prime and start winning, Prime reveals the true intent beneath his lies of empire and light. Under his facade of structure is nothing but an insatiable desire for pure, mindless destruction. This is the final contradiction and the true horror of fascism. Horde Prime will never bring peace, will never create a better world. The war is eternal, an endless death march against an endless array of new enemies. All who are absorbed into the fold in one conquest will march for Prime's glory in the next. Horde Prime will reign supreme over an aeons-long battle as the infinite universe bows before him. But Prime will never win. While Horde Prime boasts the mightiest fighting force in the galaxy, He cannot allow himself to fully understand the strength of his enemies. In his myopic worldview, he is the ultimate being, and all other life forms and their strategies are insignificant to him. This leads to a fundamental flaw where, because he will not even entertain the possibility that he has miscalculated, he cannot humble himself to learn his enemy's strategies. This is true of fascist governments as well. In keeping with the warped perception of an unstoppable and perfect nation, fascism views its enemies as so far beneath them that they are not worth studying or evaluating. Fascist governments are condemned to lose wars because they are constitutionally incapable of objectively evaluating the force of the enemy. This arrogance has been Horde Prime's undoing before, with the War of Krytus being the keynote example. Prime failed to understand Milog's magic, and rather than learning from this challenge, Prime decimated the planet before retreating, erasing as much as he could about the planet from history. His narrow-minded view of his own history prevents him from learning from his failures, and thus he, like the fascist nation he symbolizes, is doomed to repeat them again. Prime's arrogance also applies to his own methods of indoctrination. He confidently believes that his programming and manipulations will always keep his servants in line, and yet we see his victims actively fight back against their chips. Scorpia, Mermista, Spinnerella, and Catra are able to resist the chip's programming, especially when their friends and loved ones reach out to help them. This is another vital weakness of Prime. Because Horde Prime does not see value in emotion or compassion, he does not account for the bonds his enemies have forged as a potential flaw in his plans. Even one as drenched in Prime's cult as Hordak learns to break free from his conditioning after being mind-wiped twice. Entrapta's bond with Hordak persisted after repeated indoctrination because she gave Hordak a gift of true compassion, something Prime could never comprehend or acknowledge. In Hordak's defiance, we see how even one individual resisting the will of the dictator from within can drastically upset the fragile hierarchy. This is a significant moment, as it shows the power of a single individual standing up against hopeless odds. Catra represents the ideal target of fascist manipulation. She was born and raised to believe that respect is only found in victory, that you should loathe the ones beneath you and obey the ones above you. She had suffered countless acts of abuse, and her anger had driven away everyone who could have helped her. In her isolation, Prime offered her community and a chance for Catra to feel powerful once again.
You made the right choice. You will be exalted, raised up above the other wretched creatures of your homeworld. Is that not what you wanted?
Prime knew that Catra was emotionally vulnerable, and he used her longing for connection and purpose to exploit her. By the way, this is not the Season 5 Catra video, that one is coming out next. While Catra and Glimmer were aboard the flagship, Prime and the clones consistently referred to Catra as their
honored guest,
when Catra fully knew that she was just as much of a prisoner as Glimmer. Prime separated Glimmer and Catra not only to discourage the two from cooperating, but also to give Catra the illusion of superiority over the Queen. This is an essential fascist strategy, as it gives those it wants to indoctrinate the chance to feel superior over those the fascists see as the enemy. Fascist politics preys on the human frailty that makes our own suffering seem bearable if we know that those we look down upon are being made to suffer more. Horde Prime gave Catra an insidious ultimatum: submit to his demands or lose her memory and her free will. The situation looked incredibly grim for Catra. By all accounts, she was doomed. She knew that she was being manipulated again, and that submitting was her only option to preserve her favor with Horde Prime. But even against the overwhelming might of Prime, even in her hopelessness that no one was left who cared about her, Catra chose to defy Prime. She chose to save Glimmer, someone who she's seen as an enemy for as long as she's lived. Catra fully expected that she would never be rescued, and perhaps because of that, she exercised her last ounce of freedom to save Glimmer. Catra's choice is monumental, not only because it marks the start of her long journey to redemption, but rather because it is an act of true heroism. To forsake her own selfishness, to apologize for her mistakes, to have compassion for someone she had been told all her life to disdain, and to stand up against overwhelming doom is one of the bravest things a person can do. Catra's act of defiance is ultimately hope. Hope that even when the end seems inevitable, and when evil refuses to concede, that things can get better. In a time where doomer mentality and cynicism run rampant, I think that's a beautiful message. At the time I'm writing this, a great fear of fascism has consumed me and many others. Only just recently was the very symbol of my country's democratic process completely overrun by a group of people spouting the same disregard for truth and seething hatred for those who do not think like them. It is no exaggeration to say that fascism is, without a doubt, the greatest evil of this or any age. As a psychological force, fascism has no regard for human life. It feeds off of our worst instincts and sets the progress of society backwards into tribalism and violence. Fascism pretends to love its country and its people, but in reality it sees national pride as a tool to prey on the identity of its targets, who it sees as blind weaklings. Fascism sees men only as soldiers to send to their deaths, and women only as mothers to raise said soldiers. Any who do not fit this rigid criteria are unworthy of life. Fascism does not care about critical discourse or debate. It sees the very concept of truth as an enemy, and uses every tool within its power to subdue it. Even when defeated, fascism leaves behind a legacy of misery and pain, which, in a cruel twist of fate, can create the conditions necessary for it to resurge. My hope is that this video can help those who are not yet attuned to fascism's subtle tricks and mind games to see through the charade. Horde Prime works as a villain because he shows the great dread of fascism as a threat. While he is not a perfect analogy, his presentation is useful to us as a way to understand a deeply complex socio-political problem. I fully believe in the value of fiction to help us understand the real world, and right now, the real world is horrifying. But to give in to hopelessness and despair is exactly what fascism wants. Fascism is a bully, one that wants people to submit and bend to it. Our best bet is to face it head on, and make sure it can never resurface. Make no mistake, as long as there's inequality on this earth, fascism has a breeding ground. But we can and should be better. The best way to prevent fascism from taking a foothold is to acknowledge our common dissatisfaction with the status quo. The fascist has one thing correct: the system is corrupt and broken. It is this sole hook of truth that it uses as its baseline for its myriad of blatant misinformation. But spreading knowledge and awareness of how everyone is suffering can create an understanding. It is this compassion for our shared resentment with the way things are that can prevent the people we care about from being suckered into a worldview that knows nothing but violence and hatred. If you're interested in understanding more specific fascist terminology and tactics, I encourage you to check out this video that ContraPoints did after the Charlottesville rally. She explains it better than I ever could. Lastly, we must be willing to understand and accept those who grow disillusioned with such movements and try to get out. To be clear, I'm not arguing for forgiving Nazis or domestic terrorists, but what I am saying is that no one is born a fascist. It's a learned mindset, brought on by both internal and external factors. When someone realizes that they've gone too far, it's an overwhelming burden of shame for them to leave everything behind, often at their own peril, given how viciously fascism treats defectors. We do not have to forgive them, but we can understand them. It is that understanding, that slightest bit of compassion for someone who absolutely does not deserve it, that can help the healing process of leaving hatred behind. When those who are ready to atone come forward looking for help, it is our responsibility to offer our hand. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you think in the comments. I know this is a pretty sensitive subject for a lot of people, especially given the current state of things. This was the most intense project I've ever worked on, and I want to thank everyone who has supported me so far. 300 subscribers is really incredible, so thank you. If you enjoyed this video, consider giving it a like. If you want to see more videos like it, consider subscribing. And if you want to see my random thoughts and interests, you can follow my Twitter at StarFruitGrady. Stay safe, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.